Hi, my name is Herb Goedecke, and I'm the fourth generation owner of Goedecke in Bedford, New Hampshire. I was named after my grandfather.
I'm Peter Goedecke, and I'm also a co-owner of Goedecke's and fourth generation. And this is where our story begins.
I don't think anyone in the family ever thought it would make it 100 years. 100 years is a long time.
So for me, I remember our 75th anniversary, and at the time, I didn't really think about it a whole lot. But now that I'm older, you have a new perspective, and now that we're 100 years old, it's like, wow, that's really incredible. It's something that you don't see every day.
I think being grateful and being grateful for what God's given us and what we have as a family is part of our core value. When we think about it over 100 years, we've been through the Great Depression. We've been through the savings and loan failure in the 80s. We've been through recessions in the 90s and the Great Recession. We've been through all of those. And so we've seen ups and downs. We're just grateful that we have this business and can run it successfully and have survived some very hard times where we didn't know, would we be around next year, next month?
So I think for us, the business and the family have always been very intertwined with an emphasis on family. Without the family, there maybe isn't the business. And I think having a really great family that has helped us along the way, that we're really grateful to have people that have really been there for us and guided us, and a business that we've been able to mold and kind of shape and change and grow with as the times have changed. I think it's been a very amazing opportunity that we've had, and something that we're just so happy that we are able to participate in this.
And the other part of it is certainly our faith. And our faith in God and in knowing that we're not the end of the story. And that makes a difference in terms of how we look at things, and not just how do we make a buck today, but how are we in our community, and how are we holding ourselves and our employees and everybody to a higher standard. And so to think that the business is 100 years old is something that we're like, wow, if great-grandfather and grandfather could be here today, how proud would they be and how excited?
My grandfather's name was George Goedecke, and he was born in northern Germany in a little town called Bremerhaven, which is just north of the main seaport of Bremen. He grew up there. I've actually seen the family homestead and visited my Uncle Fritz there, saw the original church that he attended, and had a really nice time visiting with the family and seeing just exactly where he was brought up.
My name is George Goedecke. I'm named after my grandfather, George Goedecke. And when I was in the military, my wife and I went to visit the homestead, which my father's first cousin, Friedrich, was still living there with his family. There were two paintings on the wall that my grandfather had painted in 1905. Very little of his artwork ever came to the United States. And they lifted one of them. They said, you can take your choice. Take one of the paintings. So we selected one. We couldn't believe it, how the generosity of giving us one of the paintings off of their wall. Well, probably from what I've just said, you can guess that my grandfather was an artist.
George was brought up in the public schools in Germany, but my grandfather had aspirations for more and a hunger to know how to do some of the finer arts.
About the turn of the century, my grandfather went to Berlin, Germany to apprentice with an artist when he was probably around 16 years old. He worked there learning how to paint, how to do wood graining, and eventually became a master.
I've seen some of his work with gold leaf work, and that was quite intricate, and he taught my dad. So I've done gold leaf work when I was a kid, not much of it, but some of it. And he also knew how to do stenciling, which was quite popular back in the 20s. And he learned how to do painting. I have a picture of some birch trees that I treasure. But he learned how to mimic the natural woods using just paints and varnishes. And mixed all his own colors by hand, sometimes using powdered colors and sometimes using liquid. So he learned the intricacies of putting it all together. He knew what went into the paints to make them flow better or to make them more transparent. So there were a lot of things that went into the antiquing phase of painting to make just a plain plaster wall look like marble.
We have had stories of him doing painting in the Kaiser's Palace. And if you've been to any of these places in Europe and you've seen the fancy paintings and the scroll work and the stenciling in some of these buildings, it is incredible, and it does take someone that is quite skilled at painting.
And I know he worked in many other famous buildings. When they were repainting rooms or trying to match maybe a piece of furniture to match the woodwork in a room, he could put those pieces together and have them come out to look like an authentic antique piece that maybe was 1,000 years old.
So George must have been an incredible guy. He learned to be this master painter, and he had kind of everything going for him. And then World War I hits, and he has to go to war.
It was about 1914 or 15 when World War I started that he was drafted. And he was an older person at that time. From what we understand, he fought mostly on the Eastern Front. That's on the Russian front. And we don't really know too much about all the events that went on in the war, but he was wounded. He had shrapnel. He had a bayonet through the chin. He still had a scar from that. And in the 1950s, they had to remove some shrapnel which started moving around in his body. In 1916, we do know that he came home early in the year because his wife had a child, a young daughter who died. So he came home for the funeral. It was at that time that my dad, Herbert, was conceived. When he went back, the story was that his unit that was fighting on the Eastern Front had completely been wiped out, and he was one of the few people left.
He realized that his entire platoon had gone down this road that had sort of dissolved into a swamp that was sort of like a trap. And they looked like a great road, and then when they get to the end, it was basically, they got shot and everyone got killed. It was just decimated. Everyone's dead. So he comes back to the front and he's like, whoa, all my guys are dead. And he was really incredibly shooken up for that and really tired of fighting. So after that, he asked to be a medic.
It was a very, very difficult war. And right near the end in 1918, one of his duties was to go with the sergeant, and they would go out on the battlefield after a war, and they would look for survivors. And on one of these cases, they found someone who was wounded who couldn't walk. And the sergeant says, "We got to go. The French patrol is coming through." and my grandfather refused. He stayed with the injured person, and he was captured. And I guess a real tough chore was carrying this wounded soldier back to wherever they were imprisoned.
He was a really influential guy in the group, so in the POW camp, they really relied on him to be a leader. He must have been older, and as far as divvying out food and things like that, he had that leadership quality. The men trusted him, and he made sure that everyone got what they needed. Maybe someone needed a little bit more food or what have you.
Being a skilled person, the French kept all of these people for slave labor to rebuild in France.
They were breaking up roads with sledgehammers. They worked him so hard that he lost the use of his arm.
The family knew he was alive because apparently they had an opportunity to send letters at times. Now, my father had never met his own dad. And he would tell stories of when he was a young boy, probably about five years old, going to the train station and watching POWs come back and hoping that his father would be one of them. And this was from 1918, and it wasn't until about 1922 that he came home. Broken, both mentally and physically. My aunt described exactly what went on, and it was pretty sad. It was just getting home. He just broke down in tears, and for quite a while. And that was the first time my dad had met his own father, because all these years he had been waiting for him to come home.
He comes back and he gets the use of his arm back. You know, as a painter, you need both arms. You know, he gets kind of back in shape, gets the business running again, and then hyperinflation hits.
Grandpa was a real businessman and had developed his business in Berlin. And at the time, he had over 50 men working for him in Germany. So he had a thriving and excellent business then. They were painting houses, they were painting in the palaces and in stores and storefronts all over Berlin. It kept him extremely busy, and yet he was struggling because of the terrible inflation. A lot of it the results of the political atmosphere after World War I.
There was not much hope for Germany. Right at the end of the war, everything was pretty bad. Any funds or any savings they had, everything was wiped out. They had nothing. The kids were all pretty thin because they didn't have the food.
The kids are playing with stacks of money like blocks, because everything is just, you know, worthless. You go to the baker with bags of money and they burn it in the fire to heat, you know, to cook the bread. I mean, really, really tough times.
The money was virtually worthless. You know, 50 million mark notes were common. That might buy a slice of bread. If you had a bushel basket full of money, you could get a whole loaf. That was ridiculous. He thought they'd probably starve if they stayed there.
And so for him, he was like, man, this country has now ruined me twice. And I built up my business and I've been knocked down. So at that point, he said, any country that ruins a man twice, I don't want to be here anymore.
At that point, my grandfather decided he's had it, and he had to, wanted to get away to the United States.
His wife's sister was living in America, and she could host him while he started up a business in the U.S.
It was quite a big German community on the west side of Manchester at that time. His wife's family came from a part of Germany which was a textile center. And so most of the people, a lot of the Germans that came to work in the mills came from this town, and that's how she worked in the textile mills. So my grandfather ended up coming to the United States in 1923, coming through Ellis Island, and lived there while he sought work. He started doing some painting with someone else, working for somebody. But it wasn't long, he decided that wasn't for him. He had to run his own business. So he started his own painting company, George Goedecke Painting.
And the business grew from there on out. And it's just an amazing story of adversity and to really keep fighting. I mean, some guys might have just, melted away, but he kept going.
The idea of somebody going through all that and then still wanting to travel all the way to a foreign country, doesn't speak the language, and having to start all over with nothing. I mean, that's just amazing to me.
He understood that his daughter had to die for him to live, if you will, which is something that you don't always realize. So I always think about when something bad happens in your life, maybe there's a reason for it that you may find out, you may never find out. So it kind of gives you a lot of hope, and it's just kind of incredible what he went through.
As Christians, we believe that the Bible talks about that all things work together for good for those who believe in God and believe that He has that ability to take those tragedies, like great-grandpa's daughter dying, and then to weave it together into a greater story where we're the heirs to a 100-year-old business that has a great reputation, that has many loyal employees and loyal customers. I mean, what a privilege to just be a recipient of that and be able to carry that on. I mean, I think it is something very special.
Every Christmas we get cards from relatives, and this year was especially interesting because it's a card from great-grandpa George Goedecke's oldest grandchild. Her name is Anne. And she said this to us with a little personal note. It seems the business reaches the 100-year mark in 2023. Grandpa arrived in April of 1923. From my mother's account, it didn't take him long, even though he initially worked for someone else, to go out on his own. Things happened fast. After he painted Great Aunt Minnie's kitchen, and then she invited the good ladies of the church to tea, they looked and oohed and ahed and told their husbands they could not exist if they didn't have the same. After that, things took off, and she questioned, is anything being planned?